leadership in building global food systems that are resilient to climate change. There's been so much progress in the last decade, but there's more work to be done, so we have to expand our effort. The Advancing Global Food Security Report argues that the United States can best contribute in 4 key areas: science, trade, business, and policy. An essential element of all of these recommendations is partnerships. Partnerships between the United States government, universities, businesses, and civil society, and international research institutions, but most importantly, membership and partnership with other countries. Given our limited time this morning, I'm going to detail our proposed actions for only 2 of the 4 recommendations from the report. If implemented, these recommendations will help build a sustainable food system here in the United States as well as abroad. We first recommend that the U.S. make global food security one of its highest development priorities. Both the administration and Congress have taken great steps towards this. However, the task ahead requires a level of effort that can only be obtained by an all-of-government approach, working together. The government needs to commit to a strategy that lasts beyond one administration and one term. To accomplish this, we believe that Congress should legislate a global food security strategy. The challenge of feeding the world and dealing with climate change are not going away. A long-term approach is necessary. The Lugar-Casey-McCollum Global Food Security Act, introduced in 2008 and again in 2010, is an example of the type of authorizing legislation that's needed. We also need to sustain the funding for agricultural development, at least $1 billion a year, if not more, because the effects 3 of them. First, more research is needed on how agriculture and food can use water more efficiently. Nearly half of the world's population relies on groundwater for drinking water, but globally, 70% of the extracted groundwater is used today for agriculture. In many places, of course, groundwater is brackish and not suitable for human, livestock, or crops. But if we're able to use some of this brackish water for agriculture, it would relieve some of the pressure we're seeing on water resources. A good solution to this would be developing crops that can tolerate salt water. Recent progress in this area right now. Or developing desalinization technologies that can be affordably used for irrigation. Pests and diseases are another area where more research is needed. Coffee leaf rust is one example of a fungus brought on by climate change today. It's sweeping through Central American coffee fields, and it's expected to cause crop losses of $500 million and loss of 374,000 jobs this year alone. This is one example of the broader range of pests and diseases which will pop up with climate change. We need new innovations and strategies to deal with them. A final area where we desperately need innovations is to reduce food waste. As an estimated 1/3 of all food produced in the world is wasted. In developed countries, consumers throw away too much food. In developing countries, the food rots before sometimes it can be processed or brought to the market because of poor need to be the case. Many governments and businesses are collecting data, but it isn't coordinated and coverage is spotty. The U.S. government can help out create a global picture of this data with partners and strategize how to fill the gaps. This data has to be analyzed and then given to decision makers in a usable form that can inform innovation and policies. Today's challenges have become infinitely more complex, and we need a full range of expertise to address them. Today's growers and food producers need innovations and approaches that will not only increase productivity, but produce more nutritious food, using less resources while adapting to climate change and weather variability. We need to increase the transfer of proven approaches and innovations to farmers everywhere, but especially to women and underproducing farmers in the developing world. There are also other important recommendations in the report on how we can use trade tools, better resilient infrastructure, and promote these issues on the international stage. We hope you'll take the time to read them. In conclusion, we want to acknowledge that climate change is a highly political issue, but the evidence in our minds is undeniable that the weather is changing. Focus on that. With all the pressures facing our food system, the risk of ignoring this crisis has significant consequences. We also fully understand that the current budget climate makes it difficult at times to increase spending for everything and anything.
Good morning. My name is Michael Gerson. I'm a columnist for the Washington Post and a fellow at the One Campaign. Those distinguished institutions. It feels a little dangerous and liberating, maybe a little like coming out of the closet, but I'm a conservative who is not a skeptic about climate disruption. I'm not a skeptic about what scientists describe and predict: higher sea levels, coastal flooding, ocean acidification, water shortages, shifting fisheries, lower crop yields, vanishing ecosystems, the growth of drying whole regions. I've traveled with climate scientists to the Arctic. I've talked with agricultural officials across Africa. And this is a consensus, not a conspiracy. It includes some uncertainty about the future, but it's our job to respond prudently to serious risk. Traveling to Malawi and other places in Africa, I've seen that farmers, even farmers with small holdings in remote places, can adapt to their children across the world. William Riley, Bill is senior advisor at TPG Capital, with a long and distinguished record of service in environmental protection and conservation at the highest levels of government and nonprofit world. Cynthia Rosenzweig is the senior research scientist at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies and one of the true leaders in the field. And Obi Fudo is president and CEO of the Transnational Corporation in Nigeria. Cynthia, let me start with the basics. How is climate?
Right now we have the wisdom that has just been released in 3 major reports. First, the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Working Group 2 on adaptation. We have just in the last few weeks, the U.S. National Climate Assessment, which has an agriculture significant report on the findings, focused primarily on the U.S. IPCC is global. And we now have the Chicago Council report, which is being released today. So in these reports, I want to focus on first, what have we learned that's new about climate change in agriculture? Basically, every reports are being shown again and again. This finding is not changing the heightened vulnerability in low-latitude developing countries. Now, every country is vulnerable, but there's a particular vulnerability there. I'll make one more point in terms of what the reports are emphasizing in that's new. That we see here, right in the title, on food security. Up until these reports, there's been primarily a focus on the production side. It's like the supply side. But now we are seeing that and really I think it's with so much like discussions that we're having here today, that and everyone I think is realizing that we must expand the understanding of how climate change will affect the entire food system. And these 3 reports are made a very big step in expanding that universe of what we need to look at. We need to look at food, and they're beginning now to work, looking at food access, food demand, this utilization, price volatility. all the things that in the wider food system and food security issues are so important. So those are the three things that I'd like to highlight right now to get the discussion going.
Bill, you have a long background in conservation. What environmental opportunities?
Specific interventions which are well understood, not just one or two. It's not going to be a kind of breakthrough aha moment, a moment, the way the Great Revolution was. But the specific interventions that have to do with understanding the soils, of dealing with heavy cover crops, livestock rotations, adding more animal manure to the fertilizer chain, drip irrigation in many parts of the world is so successful in reducing the drawdown groundwater table, planting of trees, and cover crops. All of these, I think, are interventions that are not rocket science. And if you add to them the tremendous prospects we see for drought-resistant and flood-resistant seeds, I think we've got the makings of a solution to a lot of these problems. One of the worries that as a conservationist I have is that we're not going to solve the problem by bringing more land into production. The arable land is pretty much there. There is, however, a very nice balance of something like 200,000 hectares around the world that could be brought into production that has once been in agricultural production that can be replanted to take some of the pressure off the movement into steep slopes. The Chinese resilience of both brought some of these lands back into production with tremendous good effect. Again, it's a matter of 2 to 3 years of attention to reestablishing soils and so forth. But that can be done. The Consumer Goods Council at the United Nations Conference a couple years ago in Brazil committed to acquiring product lines from deforested lands. That is an initiative and very significant companies are part of it that is hugely to be encouraged. And I don't think, frankly, the United States government has played the role that was anticipated for it in helping to monitor the loss of these forests, which are important for so many reasons. Important for continuing to have the natural systems that are functioning, guarding against erosion and so forth, but also because staying open regularly, like otherwise, to contribute to greenhouse gases. Those need to be done, and I guess if I would point to a single area that is really crying out for attention, it's to marry our climate policy with our Feed the Future policy. Yet the agencies who respond to the age has dropped by about 50%. I would argue that better water and sanitation has a lot to do with that. It has so much to do with the 19th, early 20th century improvements in health in the developed world. But those, I think, need attention. And I think that suite of interventions, which farmers generally understand how to do a lot of it, provided that the seeds play their role, because I think they're going to have an important part. I think this is a food problem. I think is one we can address even in the context of great challenges.
Well, we just didn't mention, but give us an overview of how the economic development and security situations in Africa are being affected by climate change.
Thank you. I think in summary, I would say that the effects of global climate change on the continent essentially is like that across the globe, essentially negative. And if I give you a little background on African continent and agriculture in Africa, that would put a picture on context. This is a continent that is lagging in many ways the global index on food production. The continent of 1 billion people, half of which are essentially classified as hungry. And this is because agricultural practices in the continent in many ways, nascent, in many ways, still the way our fathers and our forefathers did these things. And so what you have is a situation where there is a change in global climate that affects the whole world, but affects Africa more, because where there is a bad situation, Africa will suffer the most, right? And this has also ensured that, or has prompted the African Union to declare 2014 the year for agriculture, African development. And it's a recognition of the fact that things are not going to get better in the continent, but only going to get worse. Food production in the continent is marked or is characterized by a huge number, millions of smallholder farmers whose access to technology and machinery equipment is low. And so we see a situation where a lot is needed to support the change for all of this need. Now, so what is this
huge amounts of water coming at one time, or huge windfalls. So what we have to do is kind of incorporate that into our budget. This is something that's going to have to happen. We've had to increase our capacity to get these things done, to get the work done, because there's a pretty good chance that we're going to do it twice. We have to plant early now, which goes counterintuitive to large rain events that we're getting. We have to because we're getting such extreme heat in summer. Corn has been struggling to pollinate. We're planting drought-tolerant corns, which typically mean that they simply pollinate better.
No.
Yeah,
That's great.
Yeah.
50 in the show. I remember. Carolyn, what does the rise in humanitarian disasters mean for international organizations that respond to this big calamity?
Well, thanks, Michael, and thanks to the Chicago Council for putting on this event. It actually is really important for poor people. What I wanted to bring into the room actually is the face of a person who is most likely to be affected by humanitarian disaster. And that face looks like a woman I met a couple months ago in the Philippines named Anna. And Anna is a mom who was there as the storm, the biggest typhoon that we've ever recorded, passed over her home. And she talked to me about how she, first of all, knew that it was coming, which is good. And she did what she thought was best, which was took the small amount of possessions they had, put them upstairs in her tiny little 2-story house, and she and her 2 children, her husband was away and not with her, took she and her 8-year-old son and her 6-year-old daughter, and they huddled upstairs in their 2-story house because she knew that water would come along with this storm. But as the storm was passing over, the roof was blowing off of her house and debris was starting to fly all around. And she went back downstairs where the water was coming. And she ended up standing on a table holding her 2 children as the water came up to her chest. And she said, all I could do at that point was pray that the water would stop. And luckily, the water did stop. And Anna and her children survived. But the effect on women and children, if you look at emergencies and you look at almost all of the emergencies we respond to are weather-related, women and children are who are affected. In the Philippines, 72% of those affected are women and children. If you look back to the Asian tsunami, there was one study that looked at the fact that people affected by hunger and malnutrition. If you look at the Sahel, which came the next year after, again, tens of millions of people affected. And now, today, we're on the edge of a famine in South Sudan. And I expect that within the next couple of weeks, we'll be mounting a huge response to famine in South Sudan. Exacerbated, obviously, by the civil unrest there as well. But hunger is particularly important, not only because it affects children who become malnourished and can die, and that's obviously a tragedy, but it also stunts the growth of children, both mentally and physically. So we are actually seeing this impact going on. And that first 1,000 days of investing in children for nutrition, you can't make it up. So if a child doesn't get the food that they need in those first 1,000 days, from conception for the mom through to age 2, it's not like we can go back and feed that child when they're 3 and make up for that loss. You'll never make up for that loss, both physically and mentally. So hunger is a particularly critical issue as we think about how climate affects the world that poor people live in. I think looking at the solutions that we have, there are 4 things that I would throw out there as possible solutions. One is we need to, again, do things differently. We need to start looking at the underlying aspects and the causes of climate change and how are they affecting the poorest people. And in the post-2015 discussions, I think it's very important for us to get that into the discussions. And people like Save the Children are putting things out there. This is called Framework for the Future. It's about how in post-20 flexible. I think the U.S. government is leading the way in some of this, focusing on resiliency, feed the.
First, of course, we have to respond to the disasters of today, the climate variability, the climate extremes that farmers around the world are experiencing now. So a lot of focus and adaptation is just very practical. Let's do a better job in responding to the, as Trey is saying, they're working on what to do with that excess nitrogen with the heavy downpours. By the way, in the Northeast, right here, there has been an over 70% increase in the heavy downpours here since the 1970s as one of the results in the yeah. I also want to say that the role of models here and bring in a project that I'm involved in, the Agricultural Model Comparison and Improvement Project. Because previously, there had been so many projections of how climate change would affect agriculture, and it was really all over the place. You couldn't really bring them together to really rigorously say what are our tools showing. So in Agnes, we work with agricultural modelers around the world to do rigorous protocol-based multi-model assessments, so we can assign those likelihoods in a more rigorous way. So back to the issues at hand. We work on improving responses to the climate extremes of today, but very importantly, with an understanding of how they may intensify in the future. And this is what we need to do with our farmers all around, and farming systems all around the world.
That we pointed to depressions in yield, also pointed to a potential increase in yields of 7%. Some techniques already available, understood, and applied, not purely in the laboratory. The record of the 20th century, which I referred to, was very impressive. I think it ought to give us a lot of encouragement. I look at something. Before I retired from the DuPont board, there was a presentation by Pioneer on a new seed, which is designed, corn seed, to grow corn with 110 frost-free days. Well, corn requires 140 frost-free days. Well, you can move the corn belt north. It's not so great for where I grew up, Central Illinois. But you may then have corn growing in places in Canada where previously the frost didn't make that possible. I think there's a whole range of techniques, and rice is another one that's been pointed to. Raised bed rice, you can reduce yield very significantly with new techniques. Watering, dewatering, water intake, variety of flooding, with the ultimate factor of much less water use and increases in yield and output. Some of what I mentioned about reclaiming formerly arable land, I think there's probably a lot more of it than we understood until recently. And that presents a prospect for protecting the kinds of resources which are essential to the water cycle and the natural systems, particularly around urban areas, around agriculture. There's a lot that we can do. Back when I got out of school, I was very interested in international development, and that was the field I wanted to go into. And the two anxieties we had to do with India and China. I remember the population problem. The dire predictions talked about countries. I think that will continue to plague us in some parts of the world and will complicate the response to natural disasters. But with respect to some of the other parts of this equation, I think, as I said, I think that we have much more reason to be confident than not.
Is it
Follow up on one controversial thing, short answer, and I would invite anyone to join this. Exploring the role of GMOs in that. And
as revolutionary or oversold, and I'd love your opinion too, Trey. Just try to get your thoughts.
I asked Trey coming in about that question because I have a farm in central Illinois, and there is a issue in my family, a very intimate issue with my wife about GMO. I served for many years as chairman of the environmental policy committee of the DuPont board, so my background and history on this is pretty established. But Trey, what would you say to my wife?
Personally, I would say find a farmer that doesn't plant GMOs, if that makes her happy. As an example, that I planted 100% GMO corn and soybeans, wheat's not genetically modified. I have a lot of landlords that I cater to, but I have one lady that is anti-GMO. She's not. I had folks from DuPont say, "Oh, I'll go talk to her and I'll explain to her GMOs." And I said, "It's beyond that. She's a very well-educated lady. She's got this belief, and I'm serving her as she's essentially my boss as the landowner. So we have one farm that's non-GMO."
There are huge opportunities, and it is because of the level of development that we have currently. The first question would be, or let's say the precursor question would be, how to improve the value chain of agriculture in Africa in the first instance, before building global change resistance. The chain is weak in so many ways, and there is opportunity to support that chain right from improved cities, whether they're doing or not, through irrigation methods, through the application of fertilizer. Africa has probably the lowest rate of fertilizer use in the whole world. And so this is not to be mistaken really as a plea for aid to Africa. It's really about engaging through the African private sector in a more sustainable manner.
organizations are already working. That's a way to, again, prevent people from really tipping into disaster. And there's a couple of other tools. You know, we're looking at things like before an emergency hits, can we give people cash vouchers to actually be able to go and prepare, and using the banking system. That help can actually reach them. We're actually getting to them even before and giving some ability to be resilient and to be ready for emergencies that we know are coming. Things like droughts, for example, and where we can see it, we know those things are coming. So a lot more of it is getting the tools down to the community level, empowering people in those communities to be the first responders in the case of a natural disaster. And if you look across the world, there are 20 countries that are most likely to, including the United States, to be able to be both those first responders as well as be better prepared to avoid some of those crises.
I've got a question here from the audience, from Catherine Bertini. It's a broad political question, and I would urge anyone to jump in, but I'm interested in Bill's view too. The poor are the least responsible but most impacted. How can this be used to change policy? And how can we convince the U.S. Congress that action is required? You want to start? But I'd love to hear from others.
Yeah.
Pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
The argument that the poor are the most impacted has been used, I think, quite effectively to get commitments from the developed countries. We made commitments, I think, the United States of $100 million a year in Copenhagen, which we have not kept, for accommodating essentially adaptation in the developing world. Unfortunately, the negotiations on the climate convention have, I think, somewhat degenerated into an argument about money, and they obscure the reality that there will never be enough money for the rich world to which is replacing coal. I think that there are going to be perceptions, and the day that the scientific community is prepared to say that this disaster, that calamity, really is so consistent with predictions of climate change that it's here, that when that moment comes, and I suspect it will come, and probably droughts in major parts of the country will bring it on. We will feel first. One reason I emphasize water so much is that is where you will manifest climate change most immediately and most seriously. Then I think you will find that our political process can respond, and we will begin to see changes in it. For the moment, it doesn't appear likely, and we've had Sandy, we've had a number of events that are consistent with what expectations would seem realistic and science has predicted, but we've not yet seen the causal connection made by the scientific community. Now, some people will come back and say, well, mainstream science has been pretty specific about climate, and the Congress has not yet paid much attention to it. My expectation is in this political process, it will eventually have to, because the public will feel that way. The truth is, the congressional who do not climate change, their constituents play a large part in that. Although the polls show a large concern or support for dealing with climate, it rarely comes up, I'm told, by members of Congress in their districts. And it's certainly, if you look at the hierarchy of questions, it's well down after the economy and a number of other questions that come first. So that's a reasonably...
They would make money, but in so doing, they would help the continent to improve, agriculture and to improve the livelihood of the continent in a sustainable manner. Today and yesterday also, the U.S. Commerce Secretary was in Nigeria with a delegation of over 20 American companies. This is the kind of thing we're looking for. We're looking for engagement between African companies and European and American companies to invest in those sectors lives in the continent that would utilize the advanced research and technological capabilities of America to improve production, value chain, and agriculture in the African continent. I think that's the area we should be looking at to ensure that this is done in a sustainable fashion.
Carolyn?
So I agree with what I think my fellow panelists are saying about engaging. Really, it is about national governments being engaged in the developing world, in this issue. But I do think there's another thing to think about from a developed country government standpoint, which is if you think back on the food riots and the things that happened, you know, over the past 10 years in terms of the impact on poor people and what poor people did, I think when we think about this, it's not only the morally right thing to do, but for the United States, it's the smart thing to do, because protecting our interests, particularly in those emerging markets, is going to be important. And I think the impact on the poor, as that impact grows, the disruption and the civil unrest in those countries will also grow. And so I think thinking about it, not just from a moral standpoint, but also from a protecting our business interests and our national security issues, I think those are both important as well. And when we
Make a positive intervention on that point. I was startled to learn that cow flatulence was a major contributor to methane when I was at the Environmental Protection Agency, and I thought, well, talk about a hopeless problem.
And it's the number one.
Within 5 years, feeds had been developed
Yeah.
that addressed that
Yeah,
problem.
exactly.
I mean,
Yeah. It's a great example.
When we confront an issue
Yeah.
and we apply technology to it, there are things we can do.
I agree.
The
And that's what
cows
we
can
have
do-
to do.
And the cows can help us.
Yeah, and I find that one of the more persuasive of the conservative arguments, that we may not be able to regulate our way out of this problem, but doing something like putting a price on carbon creates a market interest in creating technologies that address it. You know, right now it's a free good. So those arguments make a lot of sense. The problems that seem hopeless, once you focus on them, sometimes there are technological answers if you have an environment that encourages their creation. And right now we don't on a lot of these issues. I want to raise a question from Dan Glickman that Trey may have a strong view on. You know, Dan comes from background as a public servant and a politician, and he's asking why farmers themselves are so resistant to the idea that climate change exists.
That's a question that I ask as well. I'm not sure. Honestly, I don't understand the whole lack of collaboration on all these different communities that come together to do the same thing on a micro level.
In poor families, it's often the women who is farming, and so when those impacts come, those are the assets that she does have, is her small, usually very small plot of land. I think one of the ways is to really recognize that very point and to say, if that's so, what are we going to do to prepare women in a better way to protect their assets? And there's lots of kind of interesting things that are going on. There's this idea, for example, of microinsurance. So there is actually insurance now that is getting down to the level of the cow and the very small plot of land that woman, usually it's a woman, has as her livelihood, and actually insuring those assets that she has. And we're actually looking at models to make that a business, to actually turn that into a self-sustaining business where you can have, like microcredit, which has obviously swept the world. Can you design the same thing in microinsurance? And can you get microinsurance agents that actually are out there running a business that's insuring those small assets? So that's one idea of how to do that. The first step is recognizing that, in fact, that's true, and then thinking about, back to our last conversation, once you know what the problem is, what are the things we can do around it? Microinsurance is one idea.
Trey, let me ask a question here. That we talk about the need for collaboration on these issues to help increase food security, address the effects of climate change at the local level, just people getting together. Can you describe
happen where we complement each other? We both have the same goal of cleaning the rivers, and if we can do it in an economically feasible way, I think that this collaboration could be stretched out across the country or the world. It seems to be working for us.
We've got another audience question that's very general, but it might elicit some thoughts. How can countries prepare against the climate crisis? What are the kind of basic steps that can be taken?
I'll start.
Please.
Tough one.
It usually first starts with vulnerability and impact assessment. The International United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and their subsidiary body on science and technology, helps all the countries of the world and has helped through the years prepare the vulnerability and impact assessments. That's really the first step, because you have to understand and know how a changing climate might affect your country before you can actually then think about what would be appropriate. Where the countries are now is that they are now developing national adaptation plans and looking at how specifically, once knowing vulnerability and impacts, and agriculture is usually, in basically all countries of the world, agriculture plays a role. And so after the vulnerability and impact studies are done, then the researchers
proofs that they've had, and they did what a city can do. The city couldn't control a great deal of its energy sources, but did things that it could do to plant more trees along the streets and to get those alleys to have the permeable pavements as well, and a whole series of things. Increased by threefold, I think, was the intention, the emergency rooms to handle the people who are affected by heat stroke. And they at least were considering air conditioning the schools. Whether that decision's been made given their budget problems, I don't know. But New York has done significant things as well. There is action at the subnational level in the United States, which is very aware, forward-looking, and prudently responsible for developing, being prepared for preparing for
Maybe
climate.
one follow-up, because there is an awareness on this in many places in the United States, but the actual foreign assistance emphasis on agricultural issues in the U.S. government declined for 30 years. Okay? Became a very small part of what we did, even when I was in government. Feed the Future has begun to reverse that a little bit. I'm just curious why that's been true. Why did America's emphasis on agriculture decline for so long after really the Reagan administration? I know it's beginning to come back a bit, but I'm just curious why this happened.
I would only say there are enormous opportunities there. I have chaired the climate smart food security component of the Predator elements as well, in a way that the Germans and the British seem not to have difficulty doing, where you can get risk mitigation money, you can get insurance money, you can get direct equity participations. You can get all of that without having to shop from one to another and do your justifications individually. So it's a huge opportunity, and I think there's increasing sensitivity to it.
And Obi, you made a fascinating point that we ought to be moving away from aid and towards investment when it comes to these issues. But let me just ask you, have you seen any effective aid on these issues? Is anyone doing a good job, and what does that look like?
Well, aid has been the traditional way of engagement between the continent and the developed world. And what we see is that in many ways it seems to, aid is good, but it's not sustainable in trying to get the continent out of its doldrums and into a more expansive and prosperous net. And I would paraphrase the Nigerian Agriculture Minister, Adesina Akinwumi, who says that we must stop treating agriculture as a developmental project, but as a business. So continuously in my country and across the continent, we have a new buzzword which is called Africapitalism, which is saying that the way to engage with the continent is on commercial terms, and that is the sustainable way. So yeah.
That attention is now really cycling back to realizing that the agricultural sector needs a huge amount of attention in innovation so that the innovations that are really needed to transform the system really are able to go forward, not just here but worldwide.
Maybe I can pose a question about short of disaster, which is a form of persuasion, okay, which you mentioned, but short of massive climate events, what are the best ways to address skepticism about this issue in the public? in my view, it's become unnecessarily polarized, the debate. It includes a lot of things that have nothing to do with the science. And I'm just curious, in your own worlds, what has been most effective in breaking down some barriers when you talk with people?
I mean, I think for us, it is about talking about the people who are affected. I mean, that does break through when we talk about disasters, and we do try to educate people on, why. In the Philippines, that's a perfect example. I mean, the Philippines is just a tremendously disaster-prone place, and climate change, and though the effect of that on weather is absolutely having an impact. But the way to get the general public to think about it is to kids dying of preventable things or maternal health. So I do think there's a way, if there's a way to bring those things together. I know, lots of people think this is going to be a complete train wreck and we're going to end up with something that means nothing to nobody. But I do think if there's a way to bring those things together in some kind of framework for what happens after the Millennium Development Goals, we can make some progress.
Bill, did you have a thought?
For a long time, a number of years, I went to China for the China Sustainable Energy Program, something the Packard and Hewlett Foundations supported and the Energy Foundation ran. And it was impossible to talk about climate change in China without getting a standard speech about how the problem had been created elsewhere, the per capita emissions were much higher in the United States, and China had the right to develop. That changed about 4 or 5 years ago, almost overnight, when the National Academy of Sciences of China and Chinese government began to acknowledge climate as a very serious threat. And I was reminded that there are parts of this country where climate change turns people off, if you mention global warming, but in the same areas, people are hugely enthusiastic about energy independence, energy efficiency, solar power, wind power. All of those things are not only permissible, they're hugely popular. Well, they'll get us in many of the same places, and that was true in China, where we would talk about energy efficiency, and they knew they were much less efficient at making steel and other things than the Japanese say. So I think you can find a language to talk about it, and in my...
And the whole, at least on the North American level, the whole food supply chain, I think there's a lack of education all the way around, from my peer group to the organic folks to the non-GMOs. And I think that the thing that we need to focus on, or one thing we need to do, is get more people back on the farms. Get people to learn. I love the fact that we're growing farming in the cities. Harborview Farm is a lot in New York City on Staten Island that overlooks the Statue of Liberty. We share an email separated by an S, so we share emails. But I find that fascinating that we have the same name, we have the same ideals, we're both trying to feed and be healthy. But I think we need to coexist. I don't think it's an us against them. I have a community-supported agriculture rented out on one of my farms. I sublet it out to a CSA that's run as a nonprofit. What that does is it builds credibility with me that I'm open-minded, and it builds credibility with them that they're willing to accept the fact that I'm commercially farming around them. And I think that we need more coexistence. It's not an us against them. We should complement one another. My competitor is the guy down the road that does what I do, not a young folks. And I think that with the food movement, with these young farms, we're going to get a lot more vibrant agricultural community. We're going to get some young people in it that are smart and excited, and I think that's going to go all the way to the top. It'll start on a micro level and then build its way up.
And Cynthia, I'm interested in your view, because we've had some recent attacks on the credibility of the scientific community in these.
Us for going to the past, looking at the trends, looking at current events. Then we say, look, we need to share with you the risks that are projected for the future. This is what the models are saying, this is what the studies are saying, but we say it in just a very straightforward way with uncertainties and confidence levels clearly marked.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, let me first really thank our panelists for a wonderful, very broad discussion. This was an amazing panel in my experience, science and government and nonprofits and the farming community, and to hear that perspective, I wish more Americans could have heard this discussion. and I hope they hear more in the future, and I was very privileged to be a part of it. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
That was a tremendous panel. Thanks to all 6 of you. It's now my pleasure to introduce a person for special remarks on sustainable solutions for nutrition access. That is John Janasco. John is the Vice President of Supply Chain, Abbott Nutrition. John will have his remarks, but be preceded by a 60-second video. So please welcome now John Janasco.
Well, good morning. I am very excited to be here today. I think we've got a great story to tell you. You saw part of it on the video about Haiti, a situation where Abbott doesn't actually do business in Haiti, but we saw a need to work with Partners in Health. We brought our skills mixed with their skills, and the end result was truly transformational for the farmers, for the children where malnutrition is being dealt with, and creating a sustainable solution. Thousands of children now have access to a very important product that they would not have had access to before. 300 farmers are now participating in a program where they're delivering high-quality peanuts to this factory. This factory now is commercializing product and selling it and creating a sustainable solution. We truly believe we've helped create a lasting impact. But equally important, we at Abbott have learned a lot from this, working with Partners in Health and working in Haiti. And while we don't have a business there, we do have a big business in India. And when I've been here before, I've talked about the fact that Abbott is very committed in India for the long haul, and we're actually building manufacturing assets. So to step back for a second, our nutrition products are very dependent on dairy farming and dairy ingredients. And I think we all know that if we've been in nutrition business, that farming is a very tough business. In the best of conditions, farmers are good economists, they're smart business people, social and community problems, and when we put those together, we call that shared value, and we're creating shared value in India. We're taking all the lessons we learned in Haiti and applying it to a much larger scale. So what are we doing? We're working with the farmers on their feed, on how to take aflatoxin contamination out of their feed so it doesn't get into the dairy milk. We're working with the farmers on animal husbandry and education, bringing them up, providing them the educational tools so that they can do a better job of producing dairy products. The average farm in India has 2 animals on it. That's a very small scale. There are thousands and thousands of these. The third area that we're working on is we're working with regional and local communities on building collection centers. So if we get the cow producing high-quality milk, but we can't get that milk safely to the dairy converters, we have a problem. So we're actually co-investing and working with suppliers in the rural communities on building collection centers. We put this all together, and this is a picture of our manufacturing plant on the inside. We're going to have enough milk supply, high-quality milk supply in India to be able to feed this plant without having to bring any imports in. When we do that, we're going to create significant demand for these suppliers. It's going to build their business. They're going to hire more employees. It's going to help the local communities. And it's going to empower these suppliers as they raise their quality up to go out and get new business. The other thing about this plant, we've designed this plant intentionally to be the most energy efficient plant in our entire global network. This manufacturing plant in India, we're trying to do our part, and we're going to do a lot more, and I look forward to working with all of you. I hope you have a great event today. Thank you very much for your time.
John Janasco, thank you very much for your remarks. It's my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Pamela K. Anderson. She is the Director of Agricultural Development Program at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She's been in that capacity only since January, but already she has a long and distinguished history and career in agricultural research and food production. So please help me welcome Pamela Anderson to the Gates Foundation.
Good morning. The Chicago Council is a very important partner for us, so I'm just thrilled to be part of the symposium today, and really honored also to be on the speakers platform with several of our U.S. government representatives, Secretary Vilsack, National Security Advisor Rice, Administrator Shaw. We are so grateful to you for the leadership that you're showing in putting food security and nutrition at the top of our development agenda and securing the funding to support those agendas. So thank you so very much for that. We are partners with a lot of you in this room on the agenda to reduce poverty reduction for developing country smallholder farmers. And yet, when we look at the IPC panel report, it concludes that climate change impacts are expected to exacerbate poverty, their rice for up to 10 days, and still come away with a rice crop. And in fact, the new rice lines are even improved crop yields, significantly improved. So instead of 1 ton per hectare, they're walking away with up to 4.5 tons per hectare with these new lines. The work was originally funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and other CG donors. We then came in and helped fund the incorporation of this resistance into farmer-selected preferred varieties and helped with the scale-up. So these varieties are now in the hands of 5 million farmers across South Asia. One of the important points of this story is that this work started in the early 1980s. 30 years to get from the lab to scale up. So in this intensifying climate change scenario, we don't have the luxury anymore for those kinds of timelines and time lags. We need to get faster and better at what we're doing. We're also investing with CIMMYT to develop drought-tolerant maize for Africa. You can see the difference, the dramatic difference in these tolerant versus non-tolerant varieties. There are 140 of them out in 13 countries, over an estimated almost 1.25 million hectares, and they're benefiting 3 million households. The other good news is that this is also being supplied by African seed companies. We're also working on a series of crops that have been traditionally underinvested. Cassava, sweet potato and yams, sorghum growth, as well as climate change, need to be contextualized within a broader sustainability framework. And there are some very interesting frameworks that are beginning to emerge. For example, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. You can see that they're focusing on productivity growth, but within a much broader systems frame. So the Team for Ag work is attempting to redefine the boundaries of the system, pull in what we used to call externalities, incorporate them into the system, including climate change, understand the relationships between the components and attempt to cost them. We need to understand what are the costs of our food systems, the economic costs, the social costs, the environmental costs. So we would like to commend the Chicago Council for this wonderful report and really particularly underline recommendation 1, which is to continue prioritizing food security, and the suggestion, as Bill Riley said this morning, that we integrate the Feed the Future and the agricultural components of the climate change global work. We really believe that climate change needs to be built into these overall sustainable frameworks for sustainability. I'm old enough to remember the 1990s when the Natural Resource Management Agenda emerged, and instead of supporting our agricultural research, it actually took on a life of its own. And it distracted from what we were attempting to do with agriculture and diverted a lot of our funding.
People tell me Africa is a continent of tomorrow. To me, this seems a lot like yesterday. But it doesn't have to be this way. Faustina learned how to plant the right kind of peas. These new pigeon peas are drought resistant. They prevent erosion and they fetch a higher price than ordinary beans. And Tura here learned how to use fertilizer just where it's needed. These people are crop scientists looking for ways to make the seeds disease resistant. And using mobile phone technology, farmers like Sabina can form cooperatives to fetch a higher price. It's about seeing how it's all connected. Everything must work together. Easy. When we profit from our work, we all do better. We can farm our way to prosperity. We are part of a revolution, a new green revolution. We are AGRA. AGRA works through every stage of the process, from getting the small farmer started financially to helping him prosper in the marketplace. Join us on our march towards a green revolution.
We very much enjoyed that presentation. Next, we're going to have a panel on climate smart
and nutritional quality for people across the globe. Our panel will highlight climate smart and sustainable approaches to food security and determine how the private sector is increasing value chains resilience in the face of these changing climates, and also in the face of variable weather, indeed. And so the question is, how can we respond to these challenges? What are some practical on-the-ground strategies? Our panelists are Howard Buffett, who is president of Buffett Farms in Nebraska, and he's also a lecturer at Columbia University, where he works on global responses. Jason Clay, Senior Vice President, Markets and Food, World Wildlife Fund. He's been at the USDA, and he also has worked on a family farm. Strive Masiwa is chairman and founder of Econet Wireless. It's a telecommunications firm, particularly looking at Africa and development in Africa. Gerald Nelson is professor emeritus at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and he's the principal author of the Chicago Council report, Advancing Food Security in the Face of a Changing Climate. Danielle Nierenberg is president of the Food Think Tank, and she's an expert on sustainable agriculture. And Judith Schwartz, who's an author from Chelsea Green Publishing, and her emphasis is on soil issues as a hub for agriculture and food security, and very often studied area. So with that, we're going to begin.
We opened it up for discussion. They started to talk about climate change. They started to tell us that the rains are not coming as regularly as they used to. They started to tell us that the yields are falling. They started to tell us that they need a different kind of seed. Is there a way we could help them? And we thought, maybe this is a one-off. But, as we went through that area, farmer after farmer, that for me basically laid it out. This is what climate change is about. It's not we can have debates about what causes it, but these are the people on the ground, and that's what they were talking about. So just to close in respect to the latter part of your question, what can we do about it? Certainly, what can the United States do about it? For a start, you're alive, your government is very much alive to this issue. They're alive to the fact that we need, through programs like Feed the Future, we need to do more to help develop resilience amongst smallholder farmers, because that is the key, their resilience. Their way of life is being affected. All the progress that we have made with respect to improving yields is in danger of falling back.
Change and focus on getting the food security challenges addressed today. And there are things that you can do today to address food security challenges that also contribute to dealing with climate change adaptation and mitigation. So as an economist, I would say that getting prices right is a really important part of that story. Sending market signals to farmers who can then respond, and to business people in the marketing chain from the farm to the consumer, means that people understand the real scarcity of the resources that they're using, and then make better decisions about how to do that. So whether it's getting fertilizer prices right. Fertilizer prices are too high in Africa, resulting in too low use. Fertilizer prices are too low in Asia, resulting in too high use. So getting prices right for fertilizer. Understanding how water itself is a scarce resource and we need to figure out ways to more properly value it and get the users of water to understand that scarcity. Soil, scarce resources, and even ecosystem services are important. And we need to understand and provide incentives to use those resources based on their scarcity. Prices are one obvious mechanism that make that happen. Let me turn now to the research, the biological research questions that I think are really important that came out of research that was done as part of the inputs into this report that we've done. And I would say there are 2 or 3 big research questions, and they involve really hardcore basic science. The applied research that is done in the CGIAR system, that is done, requires some substantial increases in funding to those researchers who are capable to do that both in the public and the private sector. And third, I think, sometimes I call this the boring but critical part of what we need to be undertaking. To understand the future, you need to think about ways to model the future. You know, how are we going to get from here to tomorrow? And there are a variety of potential paths we can take, but if we don't understand what those potential paths are and what the outcomes are of going along those paths, then we can misuse the resources that we have to invest today. So improved modeling of economic pathways, of biological pathways, of hydrological pathways are really critical. The results in the IPCC report depend upon the models that we have today, the quantitative results. The models that we have today don't include key elements of threats from climate change. And so until they're incorporated, the results that you see from the IPCC are necessarily optimistic. But modeling in the absence of understanding is also a mistake. If you don't have data on what's going on, you really need to collect better data that's appropriate to the challenges that we have. We really reduced our investments in data, and that needs to change. Let me close with just one final point. There's a technical appendix to this document, which is in the back, and the report was completed. The technical appendix gave the opportunity to add a few, and I must say, really depressing results. And it's in the last paragraph of that technical appendix. You've all seen the news about
smart ag is probably being more efficient and more productive, and that gets us 5 or 10 years into this issue. But I think climate smart agriculture in the longer term has got to be about switching crops and switching geographies, because we're not going to be able to grow things where we grow them today. And the farmers that make that transition quicker, the early adopters, are going to be ahead quicker. Here's the problem. A lot of the wealthier farmers are going to be able to make these transitions. They're going to be able to hire the experts. They're going to be able to get the training, buy different farms, etc. Smaller farmers are not. Smaller farmers are also farmers that are often farming more marginal land. They're more precarious already, and they are going to be faced with declining productivity in crops that they don't produce terribly well already in many cases from an efficiency point of view. What are they going to do when they're faced with planting a new crop that they know nothing about, that they've never produced before? That's going to be a big environmental issue that has greenhouse gas kind of implications as well. In general, I think that we need to focus on productivity, efficiency, waste, and consumption if we're going to have a climate-smart food system. We can't afford to maximize just one of those things. We've got to optimize all of them. And so that's how we need to begin to think about it. Let me just give a few examples of what I mean. On the production, productivity, and efficiency side, we need to have more sustainable intensification. Increase where income is going to increase and where consumption is going to increase. That's where we need to be focusing our efforts. But we need to take into account what are the nutrients and calories that are the most efficiently produced in those areas. And it may not be corn and soybeans and wheat and rice. Bananas in Costa Rica produce 20 times more calories than corn in Iowa. Sugar in Brazil produces 60 times more calories than corn in Iowa. Why don't we focus on putting more nutrients in sugar and bananas, because they've already got the productivity thing going for them? We need to change the way we think about how we solve these problems. There was a mention in the earlier panel that waste is a big issue. It's about 1 in 3 calories are wasted. Well, if you look at that another way, waste is 50% of the new food we need to produce by 2050. Without producing any more, just eliminating waste. That's half of the new food we need. If you look at it another way, if agriculture, as the US and Norwegian governments have said, all in, including habitat loss and land use change, is about 30 to 35% of greenhouse gas emissions. The latest data shows it a little bit below 30. If 1 in 3 calories is wasted, that means 10% of greenhouse gas emissions are just from food waste. Food that's not eaten by us, by a cow, or by a car. So we've got to really crank down on that kind of thing as well. There's big gains to be made from food waste. I think the final issue, and this will be my last point, is
mitigate climate change and increase yields.
Thanks, Barbara. I also want to say good morning to you all and thank the Chicago Council for putting on this important forum for discussing food security and climate change. It's a huge honor for me to be here, and I also want to thank our other panelists for sharing their expertise. First, I don't think we can talk about fighting climate change without talking about family farmers. There are at least 500 million family farmers around the world, both big and small, who are producing at least 57% of the world's food. And to successfully reduce carbon emissions and improve food security, these family farmers must be on the front lines of climate change. And the good news is that they're already fighting that fight. I've had the opportunity from doing on-the-ground research to visit hundreds of farmers and farmers groups around the world. And the most exciting innovations that are happening on the ground to help mitigate climate change and increase yields are those that come from the ground up and that really rely on the knowledge and expertise of farmers themselves. The United Nations has designated this year, 2014, as the International Year of Family Farmers, of family farming. And it's a great and exciting opportunity to really celebrate the expertise of these farmers. Again, both large, medium, and small farmers around the world. Food Tank, which is my organization, has had the opportunity also to collaborate with the United Nations Food and Agriculture, really being seen as a solution to both climate change and the epidemic of hunger and obesity around the world. For example, trees provide not only shade and stability to soils, but they can also help increase water availability to crops. And leguminous trees, or fertilizer trees as they're often referred to, can provide a natural source of fertilizer to crops, eliminating the need for small-scale farmers to buy expensive artificial fertilizer that comes out of a bag. Indigenous crops are often referred to as weeds or poor people's foods, but and today we should remember is the International Day of Biological Diversity, so it's important to remember that some of these indigenous crops are resilient to pests and disease. They're able to withstand droughts and flooding. They're often very nutrient dense, and so they can be part of the solution in addressing a lot of different problems. And indigenous crops do something else. When they're part of diverse cropping systems where farmers aren't relying on just 1 or 2 crops, they provide a source of insurance in case pests or disease or drought again affect one of those crops. They make farmers more resilient to the impacts of climate change. The second thing I want to talk about is that farmers are really going beyond seeds and other inputs, and they're focusing on building soils. And this is something Howard's dad has talked about quite a bit. The need for a brown revolution and a focus on building soil and food loss is that we're not only losing the food and nutrition itself, we're also losing the labor and the resources and the income that those farmers put into those things and that they expect to get. And so we can do a lot to really raise efficiency and raise productivity and also increase farmers' incomes if we're preventing food loss and waste. I want to conclude by saying that I'm not suggesting that we return to unproductive agriculture methods or trying to romanticize subsistence agriculture. I think there's a real opportunity to combine high and low technologies in agriculture to make sure that farmers can do their jobs better. The most obvious and sort of the most impactful one that we've seen over the last few years is the use of cell phone technology and the internet. Farmers are using their cell phones to get better information about weather and markets, and even using them to spot different livestock and crop diseases. And farmers are also embracing things like solar drip irrigation to more efficiently get water to their crops and without the use of fossil fuel resources. And then finally, I think one of the most important things to remember about some of the things that farmers are doing to mitigate or adapt to climate change is that they also have a range of side benefits. They're not just impacting climate change. They're improving dietary diversity, they're protecting natural resources and biodiversity, and doing a whole range of other things. And these are things that
of methane. As for the methane that cattle produce as a result of their digestive process, the situation is more complex than as often presented. If cattle are run on healthy land, there will be methane-consuming bacteria in the soil, and the methane cycle will be in balance. In the case of restorative grazing, which I'll get to in a second, the presence of animals will be carbon negative due to the building of soil carbon. Again, it's a matter of management, which brings us to the impact of livestock on the land. We tend to think of climate as a sky phenomenon, but it's also about what happens to land, whether soil is storing carbon or releasing it, whether the land is bare, which creates sensible heat, or covered with plants, which disperses heat, whether water is evaporating or held in the soil and cycling through plants, which is a cooling mechanism. The mismanagement of livestock brings us to the wrong side of each of those scenarios and has had hugely detrimental consequences to the environment. On the other hand, properly managed livestock can help restore the water, solar, and nutrient cycles and facilitate the growth of deep-rooted perennial grasses that sequester carbon. So when I talk about restorative grazing, the model that I know most about is called holistic planned grazing, which was developed by Alan Savory. Basing the plants, and anyway, that's a side thing. But the effects of animal impact on this way, the effects on land function and productivity can be tremendous. We're talking about landscapes transformed. Given the large percentage of our planet's surface that's native grassland and rangeland, and the large percentage of that is desertifying and leaking carbon, this kind of restorative grazing practices there's something that we might consider looking into further and scaling up. Thank you.
Thank you. Howard, what role do conservation-based production practices play in preserving natural resources while producing high yields?
Well, first of all, they play an absolutely critical role. Conservation-based farming is mandatory for preserving resources and also maintaining or increasing your yield over time. But I'll first say I'm honored to be here. I want to thank the council. It's always an honor to be the least distinguished member of a panel, and hopefully it'll stay that way for a while. And I want to thank everyone that's participated in this, from Lisa to Megan to Tria to everybody on the team, but particularly Dan Glickman. Dan has served as a mentor of mine for a few years, and when I lived in D.C. about 4 years ago, he really helped me transition from looking at agriculture policy to looking at real-life agriculture and in-field agriculture and making that transition. And so I started taking over our farm back home in Nebraska, and I've been farming that for about 3 or 4 years now. And so I'm going to give you just a very small personal anecdote that will help illustrate my broader point. About 3 to 4 years, gosh, that is really remarkable. And to me, that illustrated two things. It illustrated both the fragility of what we're doing in agriculture and the lack of control that we have over things, including the weather. But it also illustrated the resiliency that we have as well, especially in our production systems here in the United States. Now, I think one challenge is that resilience doesn't necessarily translate to our global environment. And so part of what we've been doing is we've been looking at exactly how a lot of different conservation-based practices, and I'll get to those in a second, can translate to increasing the resilience of our global environment through our production practices, especially our large-scale production. And so, as Clay mentioned earlier, He's focusing mostly on the bottom 25%. I'm sorry, Jason. Excuse me. As Jason mentioned earlier, he's focusing primarily on the bottom 25% of farmers, and a lot of what we've been doing through our family foundation and our research has been on the top 25% of farmers as well. It's been, all right, how do we start really improving the practices of the larger scale production farmers here, especially in the U.S.? So part of what we've looked at is what we kind of call our arc of conservation. First is what I like to call anti-tillage. So that's a little bit different than what you hear when you hear no-till. And in part because I think no-till can drive away a lot of farmers and a lot of producers who say, well, you know, sometimes I'll need to till for this reason or for that reason, or maybe I live in northern Minnesota and it's required for what we're doing. Whatever that might be, that's fine. I don't want to exclude anyone from this. So we call this anti-tillage. And if you're not familiar with tillage, it's just breaking up the soil to plant your field. And nowadays we've got wonderful equipment that allows us to plant no-till without any challenges at all. The second area we look at is really just broad resource management. We talk about water management, primarily through, hosted a conference with USDA in February in Omaha where we set out a goal of 20 million acres by the year of 2020. So we're really looking at cover crops and all of the good that they do to help build the organic matter in the soil, to prevent runoff, and to do all the good things that they do. On a closing point here, I just wanted to say that tying this back together, despite the extreme weather volatility that we've had, especially, as I said, in my kind of personal experience in Nebraska, both with the flood, the drought, and then now more recently the frost and the freezing that we've experienced, we've still had a 20% increase in yields over the last 3 years. And I attribute almost all of that to the conservation methods that we've put in. The better use of water application through our pivots, the use of cover crops, going to an all no-till system, and a whole host of other practices that we've done. And so despite that, we've seen the resilience on our farm despite the weather challenges, but you know, that's not going to be the case for farmers everywhere, and it's certainly not going to be the case for farmers outside the United States.
Thank you. At this point, I think we have about 30 minutes left, and I think it might be interesting to just maybe have the panel follow up on some of these issues. So I wanted to start, Howard, just asking, how are the conservation practices that you use on your farm, how could they be applicable, for example, to smallholder farmers in Africa?
That's a great question. And the answer is very applicable, but only in an appropriate way. You have to take an appropriate, measured, and the correct scope when you want to translate some of these practices over. And so, a part of what I'll tell is just a good example we have is in Ghana, and a partnership that we launched in October with Pioneer and with John Deere, focusing on.
I just want to take you back to that little trip that I talked about to Mali. As you know, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa began as an initiative of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation to build an alliance to push a new green revolution in Africa based on smallholder farmers. As we were walking around, I pointed out that the farmers were women. The other observation that I made whilst we went around was there were a lot of young people, young men, who were roaming around in gangs. They were not threatening, but they were there. You felt their presence. A year after we left, Mali exploded in an insurgency, which, as you know, became a costly war. Now, the area that we were in is not much different from the area where the young girls were abducted barely a month ago, except on the other side in Nigeria. It's not much different from the area where the young people that attacked the mall in Kenya came from. We have to connect the dots. There is an urgency to what we are now discussing, and it's about to draw in entrepreneurs, build this around a model of entrepreneurship that draws in young people, that makes agriculture interesting for them. Because until now, the smallholder farmer, their mother, who is 70% of Africa's farmer, they see it as a poverty trap. So unless we can create new models that attract them to agriculture, we will have a revolution, whether brown or green, I don't know. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Does anyone want to follow up? A follow-up question on that?
I'd like to, first of all, I think we should not forget that the African governments have had a sea change in their attitudes towards agriculture generally, and they're very concerned about climate change. The 10% of government expenditure promise that most of African countries have made now is a really positive step. We need to make sure, you need to make sure that they spend it in productive ways on dealing with the kind of challenges that you talked about. So I think we need to give some kudos to the African governments for moving in the right direction. And Africa is, there's a success story across the southern Africa, south of the Sahara, that is not always widely recognized. So I think there's some good news there. I wanted to talk a little bit also about this issue of what the U.S. government can and should do. And I want to actually name some names. So I said basic research is really important. NSF is one of the fun. And finally, and in some ways perhaps most importantly, is what the State Department does under the guidance of the administration at the UNFCCC negotiations. Agriculture has been left off the table in those negotiations almost exclusively. The U.S. is in a leading position to do something about that, and it really needs to do so.
Can I just jump in here?
Sure.
I think that one theme that's run across a lot of the points here is that is about practices and performance. And I would say that we need to start focusing more on performance and let farmers use whatever practices yield the best performance given how much land or capital or labor they have to invest in what they're actually growing. But if we want to look at a result that we actually want to see from a sustainable ag, from a climate smart ag point of view, I think it's one of the single best indicators would be soil health. And this is where the climate world and the ag world need to come together, because if we could find a way to start paying farmers for carbon, particularly for sequestering carbon in soil, that would increase productivity, it would reduce water use, it would reduce fungicide use, pesticide use, fertilizer use, and it would increase productivity and net farmer income. It would make farming more resilient. So we really need to kind of focus on that. Carbon markets could be extremely helpful in doing that if farmers can sell 2 or 3 things rather than just a single commodity every time they go. The other issue that I think this raises, and I think Bill Riley mentioned in the first panel, and that is we have a lot.
Actually, we can also see as symptoms of poor functioning land. So in terms of drought, it's not necessarily a matter of the rain that falls from the sky. It's also a matter of how much water the land can absorb. And soil that doesn't have carbon cannot absorb much water. So you can have a lot of rainfall and drought conditions. The same goes for flooding, that if it's functioning land with a lot of organic matter, then it can absorb water rather than having it stream away. And as Jason said, the way that we look to enhance land function, enhance the soil health, will depend on the type of land we're dealing with, the type of weather patterns, etc. But certainly in a large part of the world, from all my research, I do think that livestock and properly managed livestock are key.
So let me follow up on something that Strive mentioned, and that was the role of women in agriculture. And I think it'd be very interesting to flesh that out a little bit more. So I wonder, Danielle, if you wanted to discuss and talk about the importance of targeting women as key players in mitigating and adapting to climate change, and what the role of women could be in that arena.
Sure. Right before I do that, I want to go back to Strive's point about youth in agriculture. The average age, according to the latest U.S. Ag Census, in every aspect of their lives, and this is something that the former UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Olivier de Schutter, pointed out when he was doing his term, that women's empowerment needs to go beyond agriculture. It needs to be in every part of their lives, and we need to make sure that that's happening through, educating women and girls, educating boys and men and families, and really making that a part of all of the work that we do in the agriculture sector, whether it's around climate change or hunger or obesity or any of the things that we're all very concerned about. Women's empowerment needs to be key to all these issues.
Thank you. I've been watching the Twitter wall over there, and it's been really interesting. As soon as we started talking about making agriculture attractive to youth, there were a lot of different comments on that. And so I wonder if we can drill down a little bit more into that. What can specifically be done to make agriculture more attractive? I mean, obviously there's some economic aspects of it. There are some social aspects of it. What are some ideas that you all might have?
I'll just say very briefly, I think we have to continue to support and expand on programs such as the Future Farmers of America and 4-H. 4-H has been doing a tremendous job expanding globally. And the stronger those organizations are and the better embedded they are and partnered with international universities and extension systems, the better we can attract youth to that cause.
I think farmer mentoring programs, whether they're here in the United States,
need to see it as a business. They need to see it as a way to prosper. Otherwise, they're headed to the cities. It's a rational decision. They need access to technology. They have to see it as cool from a technological point of view, whether you're talking about access to information through ICT or technologies around food systems. They need to see it in that context. And finally, they need access to, they don't want to see it as a back-breaking way of life. They know how farming is done in America and everywhere else, let me tell you. So it's not rocket science. Thank you very much.
I think that also we need to realize that you can be part of a food system without being a farmer. And I think for a lot of really small farmers and the children of small farmers, becoming a small farmer with half as much land as your parents had is going to be a very tough row to hoe. So why don't we start focusing on value-added processing, on aggregation, on other industries that are not in urban areas necessarily, but are a step out of farming and yet a step still in it, so that we can find ways to add value, to reduce losses, to create income, generate employment in different kinds of ways. We haven't really focused on that, I think, enough.
Any other comments on this? It's a challenge.
And I would say the bottom line on the research of 20 years or so ago was that there's a huge difference between what technically occurs and what's economically possible to do about it. And I think that basic conclusion applies today, that there are costs that need to be incurred if you're going to reduce the quantity of food that's lost. And it's not clear where in the marketing chain those costs should occur and whether or not they will actually pay for themselves. And I think as technologies improve, we'll get better in that regard. But I would also say that there's a certain amount of, you refocus business. Businesses are run by people, and we all have limited attention spans. And so you focus on things that you know the best. And in the past, the attention has been on things other than loss and waste. And I think I remember a report about how environmentalists were pestering Walmart about their excessive packaging. And when Walmart finally focused on this, as opposed to other things that they were looking at, they discovered that they could actually save about $10 billion in changing the way they did packaging. And so I think this attention to food loss now, again, it's always good to bring these things back up, may actually cause businesses to look at it and say, oh, maybe there's a day I can change this practice and reduce some losses and make money at it.
I think the cost of food is too low in developed countries to actually make it an affordable thing to actually reduce food loss. Yeah. And I think the cost of disposing of food waste
touches on some of the things that Jerry talked about. And we've also heard it here with the question from the Post-Harvest Loss Institute, technology is supposed to curb food loss. So there's clearly a role for technology, a role for research. The research enterprise globally is extremely complicated. You have industry, some of the very large firms doing some really very high-tech research. We have not-for-profits, such as in Missouri, we have the Danforth Plant Science Center. We have the CGIRs. We have universities doing research. We have foundations supporting research, Gates, Rockefeller with Rice in the past. So how does this all parse out? Are there gaps? Are there areas where, even though we have all of these players, research is not being done? What are some of the key research areas that we need to focus on, particularly in terms of adapting to climate change and touching on some of the issues that we talked about, soil and response to variable weathers? I'm always going to have in my mind an image of your brown corn springing back to life.
I can offer something, and that's just to keep in mind the challenge that there is in researching complex systems, that often there's a tendency in research to measure what you can measure, and you might get a linear measure, or such and such rises, such and such falls, but often in complex.
We have found with our, if you look at a 160-acre field, the number of different soil types, the variability, the water drainage, I mean, the variables are off the charts. And so a lot of times we need to be doing our research in very real-world situations, which I think can be challenging depending on the space you have and the resources and the money you have and everything.
I think, let me take a different tack on this. I don't think we're data scarce. I think we have lots of data. The problem is today it takes 10 to 12 years for better practices to move around the globe. Now, in an age of IT, that seems absurdly long. So why can't we manage systems of sharing information faster? We know how to solve a lot of problems about post-harvest losses, about post-consumer waste. We know how to address those issues, but we're not sharing information so everybody learns faster. The world is, the pace of life today is much faster than it used to be. China took 650 million people above the poverty line in 25 years. They're moving 250 million people out of rural areas into 6 cities in the next, 11 years. So what's our response to that? We don't have 15 years to do a research project on this. We need to do better with what we've got at hand. And that means sharing information, setting up open source databases, seeing sharing as a pre-competitive approach. How do we use resources more effectively? Which are the big impacts, and what are the 5 or 6 practices that reduce them, not just one? And how can I, as a small farmer in Africa or a bigger farmer in the Midwest, figure out how to tap into that and then put my information back in the system? So it's
it's really complex what you have to figure out how to grow corn. It's even more complex to figure out what you're going to do in that field. But if you do experiments over generations, or you learn what works in a particular location at a particular time. First of all, we need to capture that information, but then we need to apply the latest ability to manage and understand volumes of data, which we don't have in this particular arena, to figure out how, in 20 years you can have mixed cropping in your fields.
So at this point, I think we're out of time. I want to very much thank all of our panelists. This was a really interesting discussion. Thank you to those on Twitter. It was really great to get the feedback as it was coming in. And thank you, of course, to the Chicago Council for this great session.
Dr. Shaw, thank you for your great panel. Very diverse, very informative, very interesting. Drought is a constant threat for family farmers in Africa, a challenge that will be multiplied by climate change. Over the past 7 years, a team of government, corporate, and charitable organizations have worked together to develop and deploy new drought-resistant and insect-protected corn seeds. These are being made available royalty-free to all seed companies in Africa. The partnership is called Water Efficient Maize for Africa. One of those partners is Monsanto. The next
cannot address alone.
Hi, my brother. How are you?
Fine.
Good.
Welcome. WEMA is Water Efficient Maize for Africa. It's a public-private partnership project that was established to develop and deploy drought-tolerant and insect pest-protected maize for small-scale farmers in Africa.
We are trying to give farmers better seeds
that can better equip them to handle this kind of scenario. One of those seeds we're giving them is called a drought tego. They are bred specifically to tolerate drought so that farmers get better harvest for each seed they put in the soil.
Hiyo mbegu kutoka imetoka vizuri zaidi kushinda hata mbegu zingine. Alafu kuenda kwake inaenda haraka zaidi.
Hii msimu umepita ilikuwa mbaya zaidi kwa watu wengi. Hakuna watu walivuna, wengi walitoka bure. Lakini mimi nimepata kitu.
It's good when farmer problems are solved locally. I have been here myself. I know the problems that the farmers go through. So I'm part of the solution and I'm happy about that. Mimi kwangu nasikia tu kushukuru sababu kama kuna watu wamefikiria hiyo jambo na wamekuja pamoja kujaribu kutengeneza mbegu kama hiyo, inaonyesha kuna watu wanafikiria ulimwengu na zaidi watu kujitosheleza kwa chakula.
Naamini ya kwamba itabadilisha maisha ya watoto wangu kwa sababu inaendelea kuipanda.
The future is very bright. Anne May Chang, Can Mobile Innovation make a difference? She is the Chief Innovation Officer for Mercy Corps. Please welcome Ms. Chang.
So here in the U.S., we've all experienced the mobile revolution firsthand. There's very little about our lives that hasn't been transformed, whether it's how we collaborate at work, how we communicate with our loved ones, or even now how we hail a cab. And if we look around the world, we're at the precipice right now of having more mobile subscriptions than the total number of people in the population. So mobile has vastly proliferated. Of course, this is tempered by the fact that many of us have more than one mobile connection, so it's really about two-thirds of the world's population actually has a mobile phone today. And so, of course, the obvious answer is, how can this revolutionary new technology be applied to some of the biggest challenges in the world, in the developing world, including around food security? And there's many obvious benefits to throughout the agriculture production cycle. So, we've heard about some of these already today. We look at mobile information services that can help farmers get access to market prices, weather information, better agricultural practices. We have mobile savings and loan programs that can allow farmers to better manage their cash flow. And we have actually called Uncle. They said, you guys are swamping the mobile health system locally with all of these pilots we just can't handle. And they actually called a moratorium and said no more mobile health projects in Uganda. We certainly don't want that to happen in the agriculture space. And I think one of the things we need to be cautious of is that there's a lot of incentives, both for donors as well as for implementing partners, to chase after the new sexy thing and reinvent the wheel and do another new fancy app, rather than investing in the systems and platforms that can really enable scale. So what I'd say is mobile has a lot of potential, but it's not a panacea. Implementing a great mobile solution involves a lot of challenges on the ground. We need to make sure we're actually addressing a real need that farmers themselves perceive. We need to think about access issues, such as, is there mobile coverage? In rural Africa, it's estimated that only 50% of rural Africa actually has a signal. Affordability is a huge issue when it comes to data services, which can be quite expensive. Text-based systems such as SMS are not very useful if farmers aren't literate. Digital literacy is also an issue because, just being able to navigate these complicated apps on these feature phones can be really unwieldy. So we need to think about usability. We need to think about how do you spread awareness about all of these different apps and services when you're talking about farmers in far-reaching rural areas. And how do we maintain these applications? So we also need to think about how this affects women, because women really can be put at a disadvantage when it comes to mobile. Finally, capacity building is really important. That, at Mercy Corps with our AgriFin program in Indonesia, what we did was train groups of women farmers to teach them how to use mobile solutions and mobile applications. And this not only helped them become more comfortable with using the technology, but also help build the networks as well as communities to help support them. So absolutely, I think that mobile technology has a lot of promise in helping addressing the needs around food security, and we also really need to be judicious in how we apply it. Thank you.
And Mei Chang, thank you very much. Our next lightning round speaker is Mark Kahn, founding partner, Omnivore Partners. His topic will be venture capital investing to spur innovations in small-scale agriculture. Please welcome Mark Kahn.
Hi, everyone. Today we're talking about venture capital in India, and I've only got a few minutes to piss you off and make you think. All right, so why are we talking about India? India is in the middle of a startup revolution related to food and agriculture. Why? Well, I thought it was there, it's there. There's a demand story, a supply story, and an ecosystem story. The demand story is the same thing going on across the developing world. As India gets richer, it eats differently. So 1.2 billion people are eating more protein, they're eating more fruits and vegetables, they're consuming much more dairy, and all the bad stuff that comes with development. We also have entrepreneurs rising to meet the challenge. And why do we have entrepreneurs rising to meet it? Because we have something in India that most of the developing world doesn't have. And that is the world's largest IT companies, some of the world's largest pharma companies, some of the world's largest auto companies, right? We have some of the world's largest biotech companies. Our agribusiness companies in India, right? Mahindra isn't just India's largest tractor manufacturer, it's the world's by volume because it dominates small tractors in the US. We have Jain Irrigation, which is now almost bigger than the Israelis, right? We have United Phosphorus, which is top 10 in global agrochem. And what does this mean? We have a huge amount of talent that's coming out of these companies and that is starting their own, that is starting food tech startups, ag tech startups, and we have tremendous research universities, and despite the fact that the government pisses away money like it's going out of style, some of those researchers in the public sector are doing pretty good work. So we have all of these wonderful advantages, and what does it mean? India is the laboratory for small-scale agriculture, or as I infuriated a government minister of a foreign country a few weeks ago saying, the answers to Kano run through Kanpur. Some people will get that joke. India has every single agroclimatic zone that the world, represented in the world, and the solutions that we are capable of developing because, again, it is a system entirely comprising small-scale agriculture. Our average farm size is 1.4 hectares, right? The largest farm I've ever seen, and I've lived there the last 8 years, ran an agribusiness company for 5 years, slashed their sprays from 8 to 4. This is making sure that Indian farmers that are exporting fresh produce are within the residue limits. These are, and one company was founded by a former journalist and a bunch of IT guys, and this company was founded by a person from the pharmaceutical industry. So you're seeing the talent, you're seeing the startups. Please take a look at what we're doing here. We're from Omnivore. We're India's leading venture fund in agriculture and food. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Our next lightning round speaker is Nick Moon. He is the founding director of Kickstart International, and his topic is transferring smallholder irrigation technology in Africa. 1 million micros make a macro. Please welcome Nick Moon.
Hi, so going to be quick here. Millions of smallholder farmers in Africa. If we can help them, they make a huge difference together. Kickstart, my company, is best known for a hardware product, a moneymaker pump. It's a treadle-operated pump that helps them to adapt to climate change, improve their food security and income security by growing more food more often and more nutritious food. The context in which this takes place, I think everybody knows this story. Most of the poor people in the world are farmers. They're smallholder farmers. And in Africa, they're almost all of them dependent on rain-fed farming, and we want to shift them. Does pretty much the same job, but it's much, much cheaper, much, much lighter. Felix and Lucy have used one in the first 3 months of their adaptation of this thing. They made $1,000. Last season, over a 3-month period, they made $6,000 from growing tomatoes and French beans for the export market. So that's the reason that we're doing all this. We want to move people's income really from $150 average per year from their farming income per household to something closer to $1,000. But it's not easy. We take a market-based approach. It's basically the business chain of ensure supply and create demand. So human-centered design leads ultimately to the mass production of this technology in China in this case. We then push it out through a whole network of distributors and retailers. And we spend a lot of time, a lot of money doing the education and promotion and the marketing and the sales in order to really convince people that this is something that they can and should use to add value to their existing skills and assets. We measure and track the impacts, and that feeds back into our chain, as you can see. So the notion here is that it's efficient and it's scalable and it's a sustainable market delivery solution. But it's tough because smallholder farmers are very risk-averse. They're very poor, they're far off the road, they're difficult to reach with messages and businesses happening right now, which is equivalent to about 800,000 people out of poverty, and they are collectively generating $130 million a year in new profits and wages. And they are feeding or producing enough food to feed 8–10 million people with fruits and vegetables. We're currently selling about 2,000 of those pumps a month. But this is the macro, what I wanted to talk about here, the potential impacts of smallholder irrigation in Africa, which is so, so vital. Here are the climate zones. Wherever it's greener, it's probably more fertile. This is where the seasonal rains hit. And this is where the poor people are. The darker it is, that's where they're congregated. This, I think, is worth dwelling on just for a second. This is a map of the groundwater tables, and the darker blue it is, the closer to the surface the water is. And what this illustrates is that actually we have a huge potential impact for increasing food production and food security and taking rural smallholders out of poverty, in all these places. The darker the green, the greater the potential. What it means is there are about 100 million smallholder families in sub-Saharan Africa who live in places where the groundwater table is within 10, 20, 30, 40 feet of where they're standing. And we need to make a much better and much more efficient use of that entirely renewable resource, because notwithstanding climate change and...
Hi everyone, greetings from Kenya. As we all know, the ICT hubs, these are information communication technology hubs, have been a key opportunity in Africa, and we are getting so many of them coming up in Kenya and across Africa. Currently, we have more than 100 innovation spaces across Africa, and these innovation spaces include pre-incubators, co-working spaces, virtual spaces, university-based hubs, accelerator programs, and also investment hubs, which are actually coming up in Africa after every 2 weeks. It has been shown by research studies that after every 2 weeks, there is a new hub coming up in Africa to then promote innovation and actually, give birth to innovations that are led by youth entrepreneurs who are coming up with these innovations in the food security area and many other sectors, basically to improve the livelihoods of their users. Just to take you back in Kenya, where I'm coming from, at the iHub, where we have most of these innovation spaces, they're actually copying the model of the iHub, basically, which has brought youth entrepreneurs in a room to sit down, brainstorm on ideas, and give birth to innovations that are actually solving real problems on the ground. And, iHub has grown, and now it's been 4 years since its existence. And we are having, different initiatives coming out of the iHub, like the iHub Research, which actually facilitates the research, has a big role to play. The partners and the corporate institutions as well, not forgetting research institutions, not forgetting the entrepreneurs themselves bringing the ideas on the table. And again, monitoring and evaluation of these applications will become very important. Again, just to list and talk about some of the applications that have come out in Africa, and this is probably not even a quarter of the applications that are being developed. And we can see some of the logos of the applications that have been developed. Wezatele, that has actually provided visibility and supply chain solutions in the food security. We have iCow that has helped to track farmers by calendar and basically giving them a calendar whereby they can be able to track the gestation period and basically the progress of their cows. We have mFarm that's actually facilitating the market prices on the ground of the farmers. Kilimo Salama, which is a Swahili word that means, safe farming, that provides information on loans and actually credit to the farmers. M-Pesa, which probably most of us know about by Safaricom, one of the mobile operators leading in Kenya, that has facilitated M-Pesa, which is a mobile payment platform that the farmers are actually using to receive and make payments. We also have initiatives such as the McGill that are actually promoting best practices and helping the farmers to understand, guidelines to actually ensure that they become sustainable. Just, to wind up and wrap up is to say that some of these applications, actually part of the biggest problems they're facing is including understanding the local problems of the farmers and basically contextualizing most of these applications to make sense to the farmer. Another key thing that we need to ensure is basically the relevance of these applications. If you actually go to most of these ICT hubs, you will hear so many startups have actually come out of it solving food security problems, but the problem has been the relevance of those applications. Are we just building applications for the sake of it and competing with the hype? I think we are past the hype and we need to sit down and actually solve applications that are going to solve real problems on the ground. And just to wind up, I don't know whether you've heard about the Kenya Climate Innovation Center in Kenya, which is actually an initiative by the World Bank, InfoDef, that has actually come up to stimulate and boost most of these applications in the food security sector. And again, one of the beautiful things they have done is basically to promote these green technologies by taking them through a process of research and giving them seed funding and also helping them to scale these applications in the market and actually helping the farmers to bring feedback that they can actually reiterate and make sure that they're building applications that actually can be scaled not only in Kenya, but also across Africa. And I think it's a very beautiful initiative that needs to be replicated not only just in East Africa and also Africa, but as a global initiative. And just to wrap up, is to say that technology in Africa is one of the biggest opportunities that we have, and mobile technology penetration is definitely something that we remain to continue increasing across Africa.
As a key actor in global security. Throughout her professional life, as a member of President Clinton's NSC staff, as Assistant Secretary of State for Africa under Secretary Albright, as a scholar at the Brookings Institution, and now as a key member of President Obama's national security team, Ambassador Rice has been at the forefront of bringing the issues we are discussing here today into the foreign policy and national security discussions. Time and again, Ambassador Rice has argued that transnational challenges from weak states and global poverty to international development and climate change are not only grave societal problems, but represent core security challenges, and not only globally, but also to the United States. So it's especially fitting that Ambassador Rice joins us today as our National Security Advisor to address the topic of food security challenges for the 21st century. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Ambassador Susan Rice.
Logistics. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to begin by thanking my good friend Ivo for that very kind introduction. Ivo and I have had the opportunity to work together in various different capacities inside government and outside of government, and in every circumstance it's been a great pleasure and an intellectual challenge. And I want to thank you for continuing your very good work on complex global. Now feed themselves. It's a compelling reminder of just how much we can accomplish with focus, ingenuity, and the will to get things done. So many of you here today have been instrumental in this progress, and I want to thank all of you for your extraordinary contributions. I'm here because I want you to know that you have an enduring partner in President Obama and this administration. Not only Administrator Shaw and Secretary Vilsack, whom you'll hear from later today, but our food security team includes Jada McKenna of USAID, Jonathan Schreier from State, Suzanne Palmieri from USDA, and many, many other dedicated public servants. They know, and you know, that ending food insecurity is profoundly in the interests of the United States. It's an outrage when children starve or when hardworking families can't afford to fill their most basic nutritional needs. We've seen what can happen when a spike in food prices plunges tens of millions of people into poverty. Riots break out, conflicts for scarce resources cost lives, economies falter, greater food security. At every step, he's ensured America's commitments are matched by support from partner nations, from private sector entities, and from the public. Already, the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition, which President Obama announced 2 years ago, has grown to include 10 African countries. It has united more than 160 companies and yielded more than $7 billion in responsible planned investments in African agriculture. At the President's direction, we have centered our signature interagency development initiative, Feed the Future, around smallholder farmers, particularly women. Our commitments build on the leadership of African nations that have pledged to increase their agricultural spending and develop comprehensive, country-led food security strategies. And through all of our joint efforts to increase production and improve farmers' access to markets and bolster natural resource management, we're relying on data to determine what works. In just the past year, we helped 6.8 million more farmers put new technologies or management practices to work, up 30% from 2012. That translates to more than 4 million hectares of land and nutrition strategy. It's a 360-degree approach that brings together our work on food security, health, water, hygiene, and sanitation into an ambitious plan to reduce child stunting by 20% over 5 years. That's 2 million more children who will get a stronger, healthier start in life. And yet, as you know well, for all of this progress, there are still millions who go to bed hungry. Millions more scrabbling to sustain daily life. So our next challenge is taking these promising beginnings and knitting them together to achieve a sustainable food secure future. Our aim is nothing short than bringing about a total transformation. What will it take to achieve food security on a global scale? Our answer cannot just be more money or more aid. Focusing on more won't get us where we need to be. We need to do better. In addition to making sure that agricultural innovations like drought-resistant seeds and fertilizers are widespread, we must ensure that better practices become routine. Farmers should have better information of what we need to reach our goal. Between us, we've got pipelines and distribution networks that circle the world. We've got experts in every subject. We just need to connect them. Everyone comes at food security through their own lens, but we're all working on aspects of the very same problem, and will certainly be more effective if we're working together. And that's why the Obama administration has put such an emphasis on building partnerships. And I want to thank Interaction and the civil society groups who recently added another $500 million to their pledge to advance food security in cooperation with Feed the Future. So these innovative partnerships, especially public-private partnerships, are essential to the future of food security. I know some have raised questions about private sector involvement, but we won't improve food security on a global scale without the innovation, expertise, and reach that only the private sector can bring to sustainable agricultural productivity. Just ask any one of the 2.6 million smallholder farmers who benefited from the services, training. Also, a technology designer can build an app to translate that information into clear-cut recommendations. And that's why the USDA has taken the lead in releasing genetic and genomic data for the new seeds we've developed, such as drought-tolerant maize, rust-resistant wheat, and high-yielding rice. Last October, the United States also helped launch the Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition Initiative to help make critical data available for unrestricted use worldwide. I hope all of you will join us in this effort by contributing your own data, by using it to improve your projects, and by encouraging others to make open data the new norm. As we focus on these organizational challenges, we also need to tackle the toughest issues in the hardest places. So the third area we must focus on is making an impact in fragile and conflict-affected states, where poverty and hunger are most extreme and populations are most vulnerable. The U.S. and other donors spend much more money responding to humanitarian disasters than we do in investing in building more resilient communities. Chronic poverty and periodic external shocks too often propel. We've invested in the government's social safety net to help it quickly scale up food distribution in crises. When indicators of drought emerged in early 2011, the government added more than 3 million citizens to the safety net so that people could feed themselves until the November harvest. This fast intervention helped ensure that communities did not respond to drought in ways that could make future crises more likely, such as selling off land or livestock to buy food. Finally, we have to confront the growing impacts of climate change on our ability to feed ourselves. For agricultural societies, even small changes in climate matter a great deal. Crop yields are extremely sensitive to changing rainfall patterns, the intensity of storms, and temperature extremes. In fragile states, climate change only amplifies existing stresses and puts additional pressure on scarce resources. The latest IPCC report, the recently released U.S. National Climate Action Assessment, and today's report from the Chicago Council all say the same thing. Climate change affects every aspect of food security, from production to pricing. Climate change is not some farmers and ranchers across the United States adapt, and Feed the Future is helping food producers around the world to adjust their practices. For example, USAID has helped farmers on the storm-prone coast of Bangladesh to adopt higher-yielding varietals of rice that were also salt and flood tolerant. These farmers increased their crop by about 20%, all while using less fertilizer and pesticide. Our Climate and Clean Air Coalition is promoting better ways to manage manure from livestock to reduce methane emissions and boost incomes. The United States is also working with our partners to launch an international alliance for climate-smart agriculture, which will help farmers increase their productivity and income while simultaneously building resilience to climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But as you know all too well, there is much more to do, and the Chicago Council's report offers several recommendations to keep us moving in the right direction. The good news is we know we can make a difference. We already have. I think of those heartbreaking stories from 2008 during the food crisis, when hunger ran richer that we all seek. We'll continue to work with partners who are stepping up to address food security in their own countries. We'll keep bringing nations and organizations together so that millions more people can benefit from agricultural adaptations. We'll continue to seek new ways to withstand extreme weather and climate change. As President Obama announced in March during his visit to Italy, the United States will sponsor a pavilion at the Milan Expo next year to raise awareness about food security and nutrition. And as we work towards a post-2015 development agenda to replace the Millennium Development Goals, we will ensure that all these issues, including boosting climate resistance, improving environmental sustainability, and ending extreme poverty, remain a global priority. And as we do, we'll make sure that the world's most vulnerable populations are not left behind. In all our efforts, those of us in government will look to all of you. Yours are the passionate hands that will remake the world. And the United States will always be a reliable and steady partner to you in our common cause.
USAID Administrator Dr. Rajiv Shah. And I want to tell you, please proceed across the hall to the atrium ballroom. The luncheon will begin immediately. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen. Shh. My first order of business is silence audience. So I did okay there. First of all, I want to welcome you to the lunch. I think one thing I want to do before some folks, I hope everybody will stay to the end, but recognize the great staff at the Chicago Council. Lisa Moon and her team are just amazing. Schemes, expansion of technology, linking farmers to food buyers, and localized cooperative farming programs. And the result has been lifting millions of Rwandans out of poverty. And so she is a great addition to this program, and we're delighted to have her. Roger Thoreau, who will moderate the conversation with Dr. Shaw and the minister, is known to many people. Roger was a journalist for 30 years with the Wall Street Journal. After covering the Ethiopian famine in the early 2000s, he set out to raise awareness about the importance of investing in African agriculture. He's the author of 2 books on the subject, the latest of which is The Last Hunger Season, which follows the lives of 4 farming families in Kenya. And it explores how people can make a difference based on their worlds, and also how basic inputs and extension services can make a difference in the farming in that part of the world. He is presently tracking women and their children in 4 countries, Uganda, India, Guatemala, and the United States, through the 1,000-day time period between the start of pregnancy and the child's 2nd birthday. And he will be releasing a book around Mother's Day 2016 about these experiences. So a lot of stuff going on there, Roger. So let me just say a couple words about Raj Shah. I have his bio here, but I'm going to do it a little more human way. I mean, first of all, he's an amazing transformational head of AID. Without demeaning any of his predecessors, he has changed the face of that. Some other people were there looking at issues of stunting and rural development, and all of a sudden I get a message. The administrator is on the phone. It's Raj Shah calling me in the AID office, and she was shaking because she had no idea that I was in her office, and why was the boss calling me, and was they trying to figure out whether the briefing was going good or not. And so I went and talked to him, and it was on an unrelated subject to that particular meeting, but it came back, and it was kind of heightened irony that there I was in the Guatemala AID office, and I got a call from the administrator, and I mentioned it to everybody there, and you know what? They say, oh, that's good. And they went on, and they kept talking about what they were doing on the ground to deal with stunting, particularly, and we saw some smallholder farmer sites that USAID was involved with. And then we went on to Guatemala, and the same enthusiasm by your chief, your head of country office in Honduras. And both of them said to me, I said, do you like your job? And he says, we are changing the world here every single day. And I thought to myself, that's a pretty damn good way of talking about your job and working. And I think much, if not most of this, is owed to the leadership of the top of AID, a man who's really made a difference. I present to you Dr. Raj Shah.
Thank you, Dan. That's too much. Good afternoon. Thank you, Dan. I almost want to say thank you and sit down now, because it'll be a little hard to top that expertise to this long-term mission, but one in which we are succeeding and will succeed to end hunger and extreme poverty in the next 2 decades. Your presence here today, your efforts make a huge difference, and your commitment, deeply held to do what Dan just described and ensure that American law codifies the energy and intellectual spirit of this effort, will be very, very important in the coming months and years. So thank you. I enjoyed hearing Susan's remarks earlier. And she sort of said it all for us. I want to just note that as she was speaking, I was remembering President Obama's inaugural address. And in that address, he had the following phrase. He stood before almost 2 million people on the National Mall before he had walked into the office. And he said, "To the people of poor nations, we pledge to work alongside you to make your farms flourish and let clean waters flow, to nourish starved bodies and feed hungry minds. And at the time, on the heels of a food, fuel, and financial crisis that really did rock our own confidence in our ability to bring the world together to tackle what was what appeared to be a crisis that could move us into a Great Depression. I know the report that the Chicago Council issued is tremendously important because it puts into stark relief the reality that storm after storm, drought after drought, these consequences of climate change are hitting the same vulnerable communities again and again. And that the baseline of our effort is not a downward sloping curve where hunger will just go away gradually on its own. The baseline of our effort is fighting some tough trends of population growth, hotter and drier growing conditions that will actually put downward pressure on our ability to end hunger. And we need to be even more committed to this goal to overcome that. Back in November, when Typhoon Haiyan slammed into the Philippines with the strength of one of the most powerful storms to ever hit land, it was the 5th time since 2009 that we were called upon to respond in that setting in the Philippines alone. Susan noted this, but it is an extraordinarily sad reality that we spend tens of billions of dollars on international humanitarian assistance in the same places year after year after year, and for too long have treated that and literally called it emergency response. An emergency is something you don't know is coming, and you respond because it surprises you. These are not surprising. The New York Times recently ran a front-page story, adopt the time frame of decades. We can't adapt to the things we need to adapt to, including the pressures of a changing climate. And so instead of treating climate change and food insecurity like separate problems that need separate solutions, we need to and we will continue to come together and invest in climate-smart agriculture to make a genuine difference in the most vulnerable parts of our world. Instead of trying to work everywhere at once, we will choose partners selectively as we have with Feed the Future and encourage them to lead with their own plans and their own commitments that we can then get behind. And instead of merely providing emergency aid time and time again to avert the consequences of disaster, we will invest more in preparing, planning, building resilience, and putting in place the architecture of research and scientific partnership so that we can tackle these challenges over the long term. To do any of that, and to know that we can succeed over the time frame required, we will need a strong legislative framework that allows America to play its appropriate leadership role, not just during this administration, but during the next 2 decades. These numbers are big. These challenges require an all-hands-on-deck effort. So when very, very difficult settings. One of the things we're trying to do now is to ensure that our research investments and our scientific partnerships are really aligned with the almost 7 million farmers we now help. That's why, in order to prevent a backsliding of the progress we've seen with those 26,000 families in Honduras, we're investing $5 million with Texas A&M to deal with coffee rust and to combat the crisis of coffee rust. We know that this is a disease that can otherwise quickly wipe out the gains that we're so proudly talking about today. If you still doubt whether it's possible to imagine a second revolution in food production that can move hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, The Economist just recently published an article describing the transformation of small farm agriculture in country after country. And what I was struck by in reading the article, first I was just thrilled they were writing about it, because it's nice to write about it when it's not a crisis. But in each of the examples, there was a focus on science and technology. And as part of Feed the Future, we have nearly tripled our research investments, developing and deploying more than 25 new drought-tolerant maize varieties in the last few years alone, and investing in 23 Feed the Future innovation labs around is appropriate and important. And if we don't stay focused, and if you don't stay focused, then the risk is we will invest in creating these new tools and technologies and fail to get them out to the hundreds of millions of people whose lives need to be transformed, not just by their creation, but by their actual use. I'm also pleased to announce that we will launch our 24th Feed the Future Innovation Lab at Purdue University, designed to improve food processing and tackle post-harvest losses, a problem that not only wastes essential food, but puts unnecessary strain on our planet's resources. I hope over time we continue to expand the approach of getting young scientists, young agricultural leaders, students more involved in this work, because that's what it takes to continue to build the enthusiasm. So I just want to close with a final comment about something Susan made reference to, and that was the focus that the President, when he started this effort, insisted on a focus on women and a focus on small-scale agriculture. I think one of her comments that was particularly important made reference to the private sector. We know that the private sector is going to be the engine of investment and transformation in agrarian economy after agrarian economy. We know that. That's not a debatable proposition. What is debatable is whether and the continued success of the Chicago Council to keep us all coming together, recognizing our progress, setting new aspirations, and taking this to the next level. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much. That was great.
Thank you very much, Dan, for your generous introductions on all fronts. Rod's already mentioned that. And Dr. Shaw, thanks for the continued focus and emphasis on the transformation of lives, and particularly the smallholder farmers, which so many of us hold so dear, and particularly the women, children, and the great transformational efforts, and reiterating the President Obama's commitment from here a couple of years ago, just kind of all hands on deck commitment, and continuing that call that's needed, and it's no time to take a breath or two for efforts to flag on that front. I was noticing a lot of smiles and head nodding from the Purdue contingent. Folks here that I think are scattered around. Met some of their students last night in the Next Generation group, and Gabisa, if he's here, probably also particularly, yeah, he's waving and celebrating over there. You know, it was, I just wanted to say that it was, I first met Minister Kalibata, get on top of this issue, and realizing then her sincerity and her advocacy for her farmers, and particularly the smallholder farmers, that they were getting a decent price for their harvest and their efforts, and to make sure that the markets were able to reward them for that. So it's really wonderful that she's here with us today, because she really stands shoulder to shoulder with the farmers of Rwanda and the farmers of Africa on the climate change front. Oh, and I also want to say something about that first meeting, that she also immediately said, you can call me Agnes. And so I'm assuming that command still holds. So Agnes, please tell us about the impact of climate change in Rwanda, and what your ministry is doing to mitigate that or in response, and also importantly, what your farmers and the farmers of Rwanda are reacting.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon. Well, it's a very challenging question, climate change. And today morning when I was listening to people talk, and like a number of people trying to say, oh, we need to be doing something, we need to be justifying this, and I was, in my mind, I was like, it will find us anyway. Wherever you are, it will find you there. So whether we decide to do something today, we wait for tomorrow, it's coming. My frustration is that we have worked so hard, all of us, leadership, partnerships that we have formed. We have appreciated what was happening the other years, but this year I felt like I need to add my voice to all the other voices out there that we need to be doing the right thing. We need to be doing something about climate change, and we appreciate the efforts of everybody here that's doing something and the investments that the government of the US is doing to support all of us and all the other partners. We really need to be doing something to ensure that all our efforts don't go to waste. We've worked 6 years. I've been working 6 years at this, and I think we are getting a lot of mileage. Rwanda is food secure. These smallholder farmers of 0.7 hectares per farmer are actually making themselves food secure. They are beginning to supply private sector with food so that private sector can transform, but can transform the whole environment in Rwanda. But how long will I keep this going if we don't do something about climate change?
And you face a particularly unique situation in Rwanda, that so much of the farming is on hills. The increasing rain patterns then would be disastrous for that. Yeah. I think one of the first programs that you did with USAID and Feed the Future was the terracing of the hills. So if you can talk a little bit about that and some specifics about what you're doing to offset climate change or these impacts, and what you're seeing the farmers themselves just doing on themselves.
Yeah, I'd really like to talk about the program that you talked about, the terracing program, and I want to take it back to the partnerships that I talked about. A while ago, you mentioned it, Raj, to be honest, I really am a big advocate of this fund, and I'll keep pushing. Even if we don't get any more, I hope I get more money into this, but even if I don't, I want to see more farmers, more people out there, more countries benefiting from facilities like this, because it's actually making farmers own their own lives. Like, for the first time, they're in charge of their own destiny. And to be honest, when you're out there working with them in the field, there's nothing more fulfilling than seeing a farmer coming from a place where he's not knowing where to get the next food from, where he doesn't know how he doesn't know even how to get soap, salt, bare basics. Then a few seasons later, he's paying school fees for his child. It's like night and day for these farmers. So someone in the morning, I think Michael in the first session talked about, is aid working? Is there aid that's working? This GAFSIP money is making a difference in farmers' lives. And I wanted all of you people who are contributing to this to know that it's actually making a difference. So what was the question again?
That was the answer we were seeking. So, question answered. But I also wanted to, so it's not only, and what one sees is that it's kind of a whole army of farmers themselves that they're not, as you said, kind of, the aid is important and welcome, but they're taking it upon themselves that, okay, they see the impact of this, so they're out there on the hillsides themselves, and they're doing the terracing. They're stamping the soil down, and the planting and stuff, and so that
So farmers are very, very sensitive about what's going on. We've started, in terms of responding to your question regarding what are we doing about it, we've gone backwards and started encouraging farmers, you need to be planting on time, because the question about volatility is, it's not that rains have stopped, but they're so volatile, so unpredictable that we really don't know what to do anymore. So we encourage farmers to plant earlier than they had been planting, to use composite so that they can increase water holding capacity, to do all sorts of things that can help hold whatever rains that gets to the ground a little bit longer. Terracing is also one of those things that is helping farmers maintain water on the terraces than have it run off. So there are a number of things that we are doing, but it's not going to be good enough if we don't get scientists on board in terms of getting things like better drought-tolerant varieties, better. You mentioned disease issue. Diseases for a country like pest and diseases for a country like Rwanda is something that we didn't know about in the past. We are high altitude, but now it's a major problem. It's a very serious problem, and you can see it, you can feel it, and farmers are seeing it mostly because of it's warming. You know, so these are some of the things that are happening, but we are trying to find a way of dealing with them and moving on.
And continuing on with them, yeah.
Yeah.
Dr. Shaw, I see you nodding your head and smiling. The impact of this, and you often talk about scaling up these efforts, and I think particularly then the scaling up was when it looks at the climate change challenges. I'm thinking that...
You know, if we don't see these things as one and the same, we will not succeed at the fight to end hunger and poverty, and we won't build a broad enough tent of political support to get this done. And so that's why I'm smiling when I hear her talk.
And the Open Data for Agriculture initiative, that's also something that really plays into this as well, right? Or how would one see that, say?
Well, you know, it's open data for scientists to have access to the tools to develop great new technologies and products that can address these challenges. But it's not just limited to that. I mean, the open data ought to relate to weather information that can then be the basis of crop insurance products developed by actuarial scientists at private companies, and any number of other solutions that can help small-scale producers in still mostly agrarian economies transform their society. And President Obama launched a major open data initiative requiring all data to be open, that the federal government helps support the creation of. And Feed the Future and our efforts to do climate-smart agriculture will, I think, benefit greatly from that executive order.
I also wanted to ask you, January saying that we need to keep to schedule, which we've done remarkably well, so a great testament to all the Chicago Council organizers, runs with military precision, which is good. Also released today from USAID, the nutrition report, and Agnes, we talked about that a lot ourselves at past conferences.
Very, very important effect in the Rwandan context, because every first cow is passed on to the next neighbor, and this is building relationships, rebuilding the Rwandan society, where neighbors usually wouldn't be talking to neighbors. So this is a very critical program that's rebuilding our society as well, fighting malnutrition, rebuilding our society. But to take it to climate change, it's contributing. I don't believe in the cow. Someone in the morning actually was talking about how the cow is contributing to reducing climate change, and I do believe that. It's contributing manure, carbon in the soil. For me, that's critical. That's very, very important. So I know there's a whole lot of other science there, and we'll find ways of dealing with that. But right now, for third world farmers, for those farmers that are trying to do something with the soil, that manure that's coming from the cow is like fertilizer from a factory. That's how we look at it, and it's changing how farmers are producing their crop, and that's very critical in dealing with nutrition too.
Yeah, what I'd add on nutrition is, and why I thought it was so exciting that Susan Rice announced that we will commit ourselves to a 20% reduction in stunting in the Feed the Future zones of influence, is it allows us to have a strategy that allows us to basically map and identify the communities in which we're committed to reaching 2 million children and ensuring they don't suffer from stunting. And to do that requires a comprehensive approach. So, you know, as we identify those sub-geographies through the Feed the Future zones of influence and from preschool, and so we didn't get a chance to say thank you. And if you wouldn't mind, could we all just recognize Jada's wonderful leadership?
Thank you. Dan is back at the podium, so
just
we'll leave it.
Thank Roger and Agnes and Raj for this great presentation. We are go back across the hall. We start immediately. The panel is ready. Let me just tell you, you have two fascinating panels. The first one is on risk management, insurance, and the second one's on water. And then we will also hear from Secretary Vilsack. A very exciting afternoon. So let's move as quickly as possible across the way.